I'm going to discuss with you Arizona's private prison problem. My name is Mick Cullen, and my Capstone II groupmates were Tamara McCain, Maria Pressey, Rebecca Murphy, and Alicia Gonzalez. So, before we discuss why the private prison system in Arizona is a problem, it would be helpful to establish what the purpose of the prison system is in the first place. And depending on who you are, you may have a different idea of what the answer to that question is. So please take a minute to think about that. Now, you may have come up with any of a number of different answers. Perhaps deterrence, the idea that the existence of the prison system helps to deter people from committing crimes that may end up in them being incarcerated. You may have decided that punishment is the main goal, that when people step afoul of the law, that they need to be punished for that, which of course also serves a deterrent effect, at least in theory. You may have said rehabilitation should be the primary purpose, which certainly makes sense given that we call it the Department of Corrections. If we're trying to correct something, that probably means we're trying to rehabilitate people, give them new skills and ideas and goals so that they don't commit the same criminal behavior that led to them being incarcerated in the first place. Perhaps you also mentioned public safety, that we have an obligation to keep dangerous people separated from the rest of society in order to keep citizens safe. Well, all of those are defensible answers. As far as what Arizona thinks, the director of the Arizona Department of Corrections had this quote, he said that all of the staff are dedicated to public, staff and inmate safety by effectively employing sound correctional practices, efficient operational procedures, and proven programming opportunities for inmates. So that kind of encompasses all of those different answers to a degree. It's about safety, but it's not just public safety. It's public safety, staff safety, inmate safety by going through proven programming opportunities, which probably involve rehabilitation, and obviously incarceration in and of itself is a punishment. So why is Arizona's private prison system a problem? Well, three main points I want to make to you. Number one is that these private prisons are inhumane. We'll get into some details about all of these points later, but they're inhumane to the prisoners, and they may also be inhumane to the people who are working in those prisons. They're ineffective. They don't do really anything that you might have mentioned on the previous slide as the goal of the prison system. They aren't rehabilitative. They don't seem to act as a deterrent. They don't seem to really take public safety or prisoner safety or staff safety into account. And they're expensive. They're often touted as being a good sort of conservative fiscal approach to the problem of corrections and criminal justice, but the data on that is not so rosy. So as far as private prisons go, I think a lot of people simply aren't aware of just how widespread the use of private prisons is. Now this map just reflects the use of state prisons in the private sector. So other than the Midwest and New England, you see that they're pretty popular across the US. They're being used to some degree in about half the states that we have. So Montana, New Mexico, you see those are the ones that have the highest percentage of state inmates in private prisons. North Dakota, Oklahoma, Mississippi, high as well. But then Arizona's right in that next tier. And we need to look at what exactly that means for the outcomes that the prison system is getting. So back in 2016, the Department of Justice released a report, the Federal Bureau of Prisons monitoring of contract prisons being another term for private for-profit prisons, which is what we're discussing, from the Office of the Inspector General. And that review was an analysis of 14 private prisons where they found high rates of contraband getting into the prison, higher rates of inmate lockdowns, meaning where everyone is stuck in their cell, unable to go out and interact or to exercise or to engage in hygiene, those sorts of activities, due to concerns about safety and or the presence of something in the facility that's not supposed to be there. Incident reports also were higher in private prisons, meaning people were more likely to be given infractions for behavior that they had engaged in prison, which lengthened their prison sentences. There were more likely to be events in the prison that caused the need for reports, like inmate misconduct and assaults. Assaults were more likely in private prisons than in public prisons, and we're talking about different kinds of assaults. Assaults of prisoners by other prisoners, assaults of staff by prisoners and assaults of prisoners by staff. The review also found that many inmates were being improperly housed within solitary confinement or special housing units while they waited for beds just to open up elsewhere in the facility. So solitary confinement, as we know, is psychologically damaging approach to corrections and should only be used in the most egregious circumstances. This review found that private prisons were sometimes using solitary confinement simply because they didn't have room for the prisoners to be anywhere else. In other words, for their own convenience. So what about Arizona's private prisons? Out of the 16 state prisons in Arizona, 6 of them are private. These are those facilities: Marana, Kingman, Florence West, Phoenix West, Central Arizona Correctional Facility, or CACF, and Red Rock. Each of these prisons is either a minimum security or medium security facility. That means there are no maximum security private prisons in Arizona. The companies running these prisons are GEO or GEO, Core Civic, and the Management and Training Corporation, or MTC. And those are the companies that are running many of the private prisons all across the country, which means that there aren't a lot of vendors to choose from when a state decides to go into the private sector to establish a private prison. This is problematic because when a prison is being run poorly by a private company, the state doesn't have a lot of options except to hand it over to a different private company, and sometimes that's just a lesser of two evils kind of choice. For example, MTC was replaced by GEO after the riots at Kingman Prison, which we'll discuss in 2010. And GEO was taking over the prison while they were under investigation for sexual harassment happening at a different prison, other prisons they were running in other states. So why are privatized prisons a problem? Higher drug usage, fewer rehabilitative services. We'll talk in a minute about what exactly that entails. Major safety concerns, as we said, higher rates of assault, more inmate lockdowns, more inmates being put into solitary confinement when it isn't necessary. Higher costs, that's perhaps a big sticking point even for the more conservative, politically minded people out there. And occupancy clauses, a little known aspect of the private prison industry that we'll get into in greater depth. So let's start with the safety concerns. There's greater gang conflict. It's been noted that at times the gangs seem to be running the private prisons more than the staff seem to. And that may be part of what contributes to the low staff or the high turnover in staff. So many of these private prisons are inadequately staffed. That means that prisoners are aware that they're only seeing a certain number of guards, that there aren't a lot of backup guards, and authors like Harris in 2015 noted that that contributes to the greater risk of prison riots and inmate escape, because prisoners know that there isn't a backup, that if they can get by one guard, that there may not be somebody else to stop them. They know when guards call out. They are aware that guards are perhaps overworked and more likely to be tired and to miss things they might not otherwise miss. A prisoner escape at one prison, Kingman, in 2010, was cited as a safety concern due to the ease of the escape, which simply involved a woman on the outside coming up and cutting the perimeter fence of the prison, which allowed multiple prisoners to get out. I also mentioned a lack of rehabilitative services. So another question to ask is profit incompatible with rehabilitation? In other words, are for-profit companies really able to put their best effort forth to rehabilitate criminals when they're supposed to be focused on making a profit for their shareholders? Think about that for a moment. If the whole point is to keep your bottom line low so you have a profit to pay to your shareholders, problems that have been observed in these private prisons is that there are low quality services and a lack of services offered. We already know that our publicly run prisons could do better in offering rehabilitative services, which are one of the best ways to reduce recidivism, that is, to reduce the number of people who get out of prison, recommit a crime, and end up back in prison again. Because the low quality services are offered in these private prisons, or they aren't offered at all, we see increased recidivism in these environments. Now, one of the more interesting points that you can make when you discuss this issue is to talk about the cost, because the whole way that private companies got involved in the correctional system in the first place was by claiming that they could save the government money. Corrections corporations claim those savings exist, but researchers like Lundahl and Dushat don't agree. And the fact is, Arizona itself doesn't agree. Arizona's own data has shown that minimum and medium security prisons are more expensive to taxpayers than their state-run counterparts. This is especially important because, as I told you earlier, all 6 of the prisons that are run by private companies in Arizona are medium or minimum security facilities. So they are not saving the taxpayers, and they are not getting better results for the prisoners that are in the system themselves. Additionally, private prisons keep charging more. The average cost to keep a prisoner in one of these private prisons per day has gone up 14% since the contracts were put into place. So the companies are charging the state more and more as time passes. Additionally, there are related costs for public agencies. When private prisons experience prisoner escapes or riots, public law enforcement has to be called in to help take care of the situation. So we're talking about county officials, we're talking about local police departments, we're talking about highway patrol, and those are expenses incurred by the public to help a private corporation that has failed to do its job. And to date, when these Arizona agencies have gotten involved in helping the private prisons when they have escapes or riots, their expenses have not been fully reimbursed. So that's still falling on the taxpayers in the end. Right, this picture gives us a little bit of an idea of some of the damage that happened during the Kingman prisoner riot that happened in 2015. There have been a couple of major incidents just at the Kingman facility by itself. In 2010, as I mentioned, 3 prisoners accused of murder escaped from the prison by someone simply cutting the outside fence. One of the escapees committed murder while out on the lam, which killed an Oklahoma couple in New Mexico, attempted to steal their car, and all of that incurred expenses that, again, were taken on by the taxpayers. In 2015, the prison experienced a prison riot, which caused so much damage to the facilities that over 1,000 inmates had to be relocated to other prisons, both for lack of appropriate facilities and for safety concerns. And that, surprisingly, even though Arizona was doing the right thing in that situation, ended up costing Arizona even more money than simply the costs of relocation. And that's because of occupancy clauses. Occupancy clauses in these contracts with private prison companies guarantee that their cells will be filled. So when a private company contracts with the state, if they insert an occupancy clause and the state agrees to it, for example, they could say you have to guarantee that 80% of these beds will be filled with inmates, that you will give us enough inmates to have enough cells filled that we can make a profit. So that means private prisons are profiting and are guaranteed to profit, and that comes at taxpayer expense. The question is, what's the right number? So this varies from state to state, but Arizona's occupancy clauses are quite high. With the 6 prisons that we mentioned earlier that are private in Arizona, the occupancy clauses range from 90 to 100%. No other state guarantees a 100% occupancy at any of their private prisons, but Arizona guarantees it at 3 of the 6 private prisons. 100%. They guarantee that every one of those cells, every one of those beds will have a prisoner in it, which again guarantees profit. What happens if crime rates change? What happens if we have some really great public policy successes that reduce the number of people committing crimes? Doesn't matter. Too bad. The occupancy clause still is in effect. That means that suppose there's a 20% drop. That's wishful thinking perhaps, but let's just say there's a 20% drop over a 10-year period in the number of people who are getting sent to prison. These clauses require that those private prisons get filled before the public ones, which means the public prisons have fewer and fewer inmates and may have to start laying off staff, or staff are getting paid when they're taking care of fewer people, and it's not cost efficient for the taxpayer. So we've established the problem. The question is, what do we do about it? We have a few options. Rehabilitation and reentry training for prisoners. We can eliminate the occupancy clauses that we were just discussing, and we can decline to renew contracts when they come up for renewal. Let's dig into each one of these with a little bit more detail. Rehabilitation and reentry training. Reintegration programs teach inmates necessary life skills such as budgeting, creating a resume, and assisting them in obtaining a job once they're out. We can incorporate drug rehabilitation into these reintegration programs, and all told, these programs have helped to reduce recidivism. The current programs in Arizona, which some are in private, some are in public facilities, have had pretty good success. But private companies that are running prisons are less likely to incorporate good reintegration programs, drug rehabilitation, anything that reduces recidivism, because, well, two major reasons. Number one, it costs money to put drug rehab into place, and there isn't really a return on investment for that prison because they benefit from more people being in the prison system. They don't really have an interest, at least economically, in rehabilitating people. The individual people working in these prisons may care about the prisoners, but the company itself doesn't, and that trickles down to their policies and their day-to-day practices. Finally, we can eliminate occupancy clauses. Occupancy clauses, perhaps the most capitalistic element of all of this. We have the question, should the state really be in the business of guaranteeing the profits of a private company? They're contracting with the company. If the company has to put an occupancy clause into its contract to guarantee that it makes a profit, that puts the state in a position of continuing to feed prisoners into the system, which raises a lot of ethical questions. Should the state feel like it has to keep people in prison in order to avoid paying penalties to a private company? Can the state justify the increased recidivism that exists because these companies don't have the rehabilitative services in place that they should have, or they don't have the high quality people running those programs that other facilities may? Can we really say that the benefits outweigh the costs? If we accept that recidivism will be higher, if we accept that assaults and prison are higher and prisoner safety is lower and staff safety is lower, is that all worth it if we save money? That may be a moot point because it doesn't seem like we actually do save money, but we will get back to that in a minute. We can also decline to renew any of the contracts. From 2000 to 2016, private prisons were discontinued in 8 states. Each of these states had private prisons, they were operating them, and they ceased to do so for a number of varied reasons, from financial considerations to rampant prisoner misconduct to sexual and physical abuse of prisoners by prison staff. This does mean that there's a roadmap out there. There's something Arizona can do in order to follow suit. They don't have to kind of reinvent the wheel. They don't have to be the trailblazer trying to figure out how do we move back to a system where the prisons are entirely being run by the state, because other states have done it, like Kentucky. Let's take a look at how they accomplished this goal. They did a case-by-case evaluation, individual assessments of each inmate, and decided, do they all need to be in prison? They moved some to state-run prisons out of the private prison facilities. They moved some to county jails. They put some in halfway houses, and that all depended on their individual situations and needs. Another issue is that whenever these private prisons shut down, there's a concern about the people who are working in them. Private prisons are very savvy about making sure that they establish themselves in areas that often have a need for greater employment, especially rural areas where there aren't a lot of other industries available. You build a prison in one of these areas, it gives a huge boost to the local economy. Many people have jobs that maybe didn't before, and then that community doesn't want that prison to go away. Understandably, they don't want to lose all those jobs. Kentucky solved that by offering jobs to many of those private prison employees in the public sector. Of course, they didn't offer jobs to those that were engaged in the more egregious behavior of assaulting and or otherwise abusing the inmates. Kentucky also made sure they ensured continued access to drug rehab for those prison inmates who were going through rehabilitation. They didn't have to abruptly stop and then either not get continued care or have to restart somewhere else. They ensured that they would continue to have access to their rehabilitative services as they transitioned from a private facility to a public one. Going through this process, it's estimated by the Correctional News that Kentucky is saving $1.5 to $2.5 million each year. That money being saved by the correctional system can be used for lots of things: facility construction, facility expansion, or the establishment of better rehabilitative and reintegrative programs to reduce recidivism, so we don't have the need to continue to pour as much money into the correctional system. Let's take a look at one other state, Louisiana. Their Justice Reinforcement Task Force came up with a number of recommendations to ease the process of transitioning from a mixed use of private and public facilities to public only. Number one, they said we should only really be incarcerating the most dangerous criminals. This was a major shift for Louisiana because they were really taking a tough on crime approach for quite some time. So the state appointed task force said that we could do a few different things. Number one, we could get low-level drug offenders into treatment programs instead of long-term incarceration. We know that rehabilitation works better than punishment when we're dealing with drug crimes, especially if the people who've committed those crimes are dealing with addiction. We also had recommendations from the task force, including eliminating child support payments during incarceration, increasing incentives for involvement in vocational opportunities, and scaling financial penalties in accordance with offenders' financial situations so that fines did not become another system of or another aspect of systemic oppression. The task force also recommended better community-based supervision, especially when offenders were more likely to reoffend. They recognized that stronger supervision during high-risk times could stop people from getting involved with others who are into criminal activity, who may have been involved in criminal activity the first time around when these individuals got into prison in the first place. This enables inmates to succeed after release, and we can enhance that community-based supervision to ensure their continued success. Instead of just releasing them and saying good luck, we need to have a continuation of care. We have the staff out there, probation officers and parole officers, to handle that. Overall, Arizona deserves better. They deserve safer conditions for prisoners, for staff of the prisons, and for the general public. Private prisons aren't accomplishing any of those things. They deserve better results. Whether we're talking about reducing recidivism, whether we're talking about getting people back into the job market altogether, we know that private prisons are not accomplishing that as well as their public counterparts. And lower expenses. The fact is, we know that these minimum and medium security prisons, the only private prisons that Arizona has, are more expensive than their public counterparts. So we can save the taxpayers' money by getting away from this private-driven system and moving back toward a public system. And the nice thing about Arizona's contracts is if we decline to renew them, that property goes back to Arizona. So Arizona owns the prisons, they own the property the prisons are on, and they can simply continue to employ the same people if they wish to do so, or replace them with better trained individuals from the state. Arizona's private prison system isn't helping anyone except the companies and their stockholders, and that's not who we should be focusing upon. Thank you for watching this presentation. I will post the discussion questions in the discussion board with this link.